cancel the medical transfer, and have the private secretary wait outside. 11 words, said at normal volume in a corridor in the east wing of Buckingham Palace at about 4:30 in the afternoon, and the whole floor stopped moving. Behind the door at the end of that corridor, the Queen had been in a darkened room for 2 days. Curtains drawn, telephone diverted, meals going in on a tray and coming back out mostly untouched. A letter from a private clinic in Chelsea had been circulating in the household since the Friday, and one paragraph of that letter said that taking her household responsibilities away from her at this point would set her recovery back badly. Because of that paragraph, the King had stopped signing. The document he had stopped signing would have handed control of the private royal purse to his sister. Every allowance, every discretionary payment, every private staff wage in that building, into the hands of the one member of that family nobody has ever accused of spending a penny loosely. And what Anne had worked out that afternoon, about 90 minutes before she said those 11 words, is that the paragraph which stopped it was not written by a doctor. By 7 o'clock that evening, the Queen of the United Kingdom was in the back of a car on the A4 heading west, and her office had been stripped of every budget it held. Now, the thing I'm going to hold on to for a while, because it needs the rest of the story underneath it before it means anything. That paragraph runs to 31 words. It arrived at the clinic already typed. And the man who put it into a medical letter has never once claimed he wrote it. Quick word before we go further. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the household accounts, the letters, the small pieces of paper that get treated as unimportant right up until the afternoon somebody reads one properly. Stay with me to the end of this one, because the thing that finished it is not the illness, and it is not the doctor. It is one line in an email, sent at 11 minutes past 9 on a Thursday morning, and it is the reason a queen slept in Wiltshire that night. Let me start with the money, because the money is the reason all of this happened, and almost nobody outside that building understands how it works. The private royal purse is not the taxpayers' money, and it is not the sovereign grant that pays for state duties. It is the internal engine. Private staff wages, the maintenance nobody sees, personal allowances, the discretionary payments that keep a household of several hundred people running. Quick note before we continue, everything I dig up that doesn't make it into these videos I put into a free weekly letter. Join more than 10,000 royal insiders at crownletter.com. The link is in the pinned comment below. If you're watching on your TV, just point your phone at the QR code on screen. It has been managed loosely for a very long time, in the sense that individual households inside that institution have historically been able to authorize their own spending and account for it afterwards. Charles had decided to end that. He had been working on it for the better part of a year. Anybody who has followed that man's career knows he has wanted to shrink and tighten that institution since he was in his 40s, and the accession finally gave him the authority to do it. The plan was a single point of control over internal spending, with everything above a modest threshold requiring sign-off from one office. And he chose his sister to run it. That choice tells you everything about what he thought the problem was. Anne is 75 years old. She carried out 478 public engagements in 2025, which is more days of actual work than almost anybody else in that family, and she does it without a personal press team, without a stylist, and famously without changing an outfit she has decided still fits. She has been photographed in the same coat across 4 decades. That woman going through the household accounts line by line is a specific kind of event, and everybody inside that building understood what it meant. For most of the households, it meant paperwork. For one of them, it meant the end of an arrangement that had been running for 20 years. Because over those 20 years, the Queen had built something inside those walls that has no name and does not appear on any organization chart. Private staff, a communications operation of her own, discretionary payments to people who do things for her that nobody has ever been asked to describe in writing, allowances that go out to her extended circle under headings that would take an auditor about 4 hours to unpick and about 4 minutes to query. None of that is illegal, and I want to be clear about that before we go a sentence further. Every large household inside that institution has some version of it. Hers was the largest, and it was the one built most recently, and it was the one that existed entirely because of one marriage. A single point of control meant every one of those payments crossing one desk, and the person at that desk was going to be a woman who has spent 50 years declining to be impressed by anybody. The threshold in the draft was £5,000. Anything above it needed a second signature. That number looks generous until somebody who knows those accounts explains what sits underneath it, which is that almost nothing routine in that building costs £5,000. Roofs and cars and security cost far more and already go through the proper channels. 5,000 is the band where the discretionary money lives. Retainers, consultancies, standing arrangements with people who are not on the staff list. Anne's office had run a first pass over one household's figures before any of this started as a test of the method. And the note that came back said that in a single year, 14 separate arrangements sat between £4,000 and £5,000 each. 14 payments, none of them individually large enough to be interesting. All of them landing under a line that did not exist yet. Nobody has ever suggested that was deliberate. It also stopped happening the week the threshold was circulated. She tried the ordinary route first, and the ordinary route is worth describing because it was entirely reasonable and it very nearly worked. She went to her husband and made an argument. Not a scene, not an ultimatum. An argument of the kind two people who have been together for a long time make to each other about a practical matter. The argument was that his sister was 75, that she already worked harder than anybody in the family, and that adding the household accounts to a diary that full was unkind and would end badly. She suggested the oversight site with her own office instead, on the grounds that she was in the building every day, that she knew the staff, and that continuity mattered more than austerity. Every part of that is a sensible thing to say. If a stranger read the transcript, they would think it was good advice. Charles said no. He said no more than once, and by the second week of it the thing had stopped being a discussion and become a decision that had already been taken, which everybody around him could see, and which she could see better than anybody. The instrument was drafted. The signing was put in the diary for the end of that week. Now, the household, and this is the part outsiders never get. That building runs on the keeper of the Privy Purse, which is a real office with a real holder and has existed in some form since the 16th century. It is the closest thing that institution has to a finance director. Every household inside the building deals with that office, and every household inside the building has spent generations working out how to deal with it in a way that produces the answer they want. The change Charles was proposing did not abolish that office. It put a member of the royal family above it, with a veto. That is the whole change, and it is why it mattered so much. An official can be persuaded, outranked, waited out, or gone round. A princess of the blood who has decided your allowance is unnecessary cannot be any of those things. The people who understood the change quickest were not the principals. They were the private secretaries, and by the middle of that week, 2 of them had quietly asked for meetings about things they suddenly wanted to have on the record. 2 private secretaries asking for meetings in the same week is not normal in that building, and it is worth saying what one of them wanted. He wanted a note in the file recording that a standing arrangement in his own household had been set up before his time, on verbal instruction, and that he had never seen written authority for it. That is what people do when they can see an audit coming. They do not destroy anything. They write a short, polite, dull memorandum establishing that whatever is about to be found was not their idea. 4 of those memoranda were filed in the 10 days before the letter arrived, across 3 households, and every one of them is a small piece of evidence that a great many people inside that building knew exactly what Anne was going to find. Then the Queen began to look unwell. I want to walk through this carefully and slowly, because the whole video turns on getting this right, and because the sloppy version of this story that has gone round online gets it badly wrong. She did not invent an illness. Nobody has ever produced anything to suggest she did, and I am not going to suggest it either. People around her noticed a change over about 10 days. She looked pale at internal briefings. She had stopped coming to 2 of the standing meetings she normally chairs. She spoke more quietly. She left a lunch early. Somebody who has worked in that household for 19 years said afterwards that she looked like somebody running on nothing. That woman is 79 years old. She has been the second most photographed person in every room she has entered for 2 decades. She had spent the previous 18 months watching her husband go through medical treatment in public while carrying his diary as well as her own. Anybody in that position could be exhausted. Most people in that position would be. That is the fair version, and it holds all the way through this story, and I will come back to it at the end, because it never stops being true even after everything else lands. Then the letter arrived. It came from a private clinic in Chelsea, on headed paper, signed by a consultant with a long and entirely respectable list of letters after his name. It went to the King's private office on a Friday afternoon. It described a diagnosis. Exhaustion of a clinical kind, with an accompanying low mood, arrived at after assessment, with a recommendation of rest and a reduced schedule for a period of weeks. Every word of that is ordinary. Letters like it go out of private clinics in London 100 times a week, about company directors and judges and people who present the weather, and there is nothing remarkable about a single line of it. Except one paragraph. The paragraph sat near the end, after the recommendation and before the sign-off, and it did something that the rest of the letter did not do. It talked about her job. It said that any sudden restructuring of the patient's household responsibilities or the removal of her established administrative role would be likely to cause a significant setback to recovery, and that maintaining her existing oversight of household matters would provide the routine and sense of purpose that recovery depends on. 31 words in the operative part of it. Read them again and notice what they are not. They are not a description of a patient. They are not a diagnosis, a prognosis, a treatment, or a medication. They are an instruction to a third party about an administrative decision, sitting inside a clinical document wearing a doctor's signature. That paragraph did not exist to describe anybody's health. It existed to stop a signing on Friday. Charles read it on the Friday evening and he stopped everything. Understand what that letter did to that particular man, because it was aimed at him with real precision, and it hit exactly where it was aimed. He is 77. He has spent his own last 2 years in and out of treatment in public, with the whole country reading updates about him. He knows precisely what it is to be the person in the room whose diary everybody else is quietly managing, and he has spent a very large part of his adult life being told, by newspapers and by his own family, that his judgment about the woman he married is not to be trusted. Put a letter in front of that man saying his wife will be harmed if he goes ahead, and there is no version of him that signs on Friday. He cancelled the signing. He did not reschedule it. He went upstairs. For the next 2 days he was in and out of that room constantly. People who were on that floor describe him coming down for 20 minutes at a time and going straight back up. He cancelled 2 engagements himself, which he almost never does. And by the Sunday evening, the household had begun drafting a bulletin, because a queen who has not been seen for 2 days generates questions by about the 3rd one. The bulletin got as far as a 3rd draft and never went out. The wording of a bulletin like that is a science in that building, and it has been for a century. The draft said the Queen was resting on medical advice, that engagements for the coming fortnight had been postponed, and that Her Majesty was grateful for the messages received. 2 lines, every word of it argued over by 4 people. Diana's health was described in bulletins out of that same office for years, and every one of them was written by people who had not been in a room with her that week. The reason this one never went out is the reason it was being written at all. The moment that bulletin left the building, the illness stopped being a family matter and became a public fact, and public facts are extremely difficult to reverse. Somebody in the King's office wanted to wait 1 more day. That decision saved everybody involved from something they have not fully appreciated yet, which is that if that bulletin had gone out on the Sunday, everything that happened on the Tuesday would have had to happen in front of the entire country. There was also a second document being prepared, and this is the part that put a clock on everything. Somebody in her office had drafted a temporary instrument. Not the full transfer, nothing permanent. A short interim arrangement under which household financial oversight would sit with the Queen's office while she recovered, so that nothing seized up, and so that she had, in the words of the covering note, the continuity her clinicians consider therapeutic. The covering note used the plural. Clinicians. There was one letter and one signature on it. Charles was ready to sign the interim instrument on the Tuesday afternoon. Everybody around him has said the same thing about his state of mind, which is that he was not being manipulated in any way he could have identified. He was a tired man who had been handed a piece of paper saying the alternative would hurt his wife. Now, Anne. She had been given a copy of the clinic letter on the Saturday morning because she was the person whose appointment it had cancelled, and somebody had the sense to send it to her. She did not ring anybody. She did not go to her brother. She read it, and then she read it again. And then she did the thing that has made that woman the most quietly dangerous person in that institution for 50 years. She looked at the object rather than the argument. The letter is 2 pages. The paragraph in question sits on the second page. And on a printed copy, held up under a decent light, the typeface in that paragraph does not match the rest of the document. Not dramatically, the spacing between the lines is fractionally tighter and the apostrophes lean the wrong way. It is the specific mismatch you get when a block of text has been written somewhere else and pasted into a document, and nobody has bothered to clean up the formatting, because nobody expected anybody to look. That is the entire clue. A tiny piece of typography. She said nothing about it for 3 days. I have gone round and round on why she waited, and I think the answer is the simplest one available. She had a formatting anomaly and nothing else. Walking into her brother's study on the Saturday of a health crisis, in the middle of the worst weekend he had had in 2 years, holding a letter and a theory about apostrophes, would have ended her involvement in this permanently, and would have looked exactly like what her sister-in-law had been telling him it was, which is a woman who wanted the job and would not let it go. She needed a reason to go and ask a question. And the reason walked past her study door on the Tuesday afternoon at about 2:20. Before that, one more piece, because it explains why Anne of all people was never going to let this go. Anne watched her brother's first marriage from a closer distance than anybody except the 2 people inside it. She watched what a household does when it decides a story about somebody. She watched Diana be described, for years, by perfectly reasonable people. In perfectly reasonable language, in documents that went round that building, and that nobody outside it ever saw. Unstable. Difficult. Not coping. Needs managing. Not one of those documents was ever shown to Diana. Not one of them was ever signed by anybody who could be asked about it afterwards. Anne has never spoken about that period publicly, and she isn't going to. On the record is her behavior ever since, which is that she does not accept a characterization of a person from a piece of paper without finding out who wrote it. 30 years earlier, a description had been used to take things away from a woman in that family. She was now holding a description being used to keep things. Prince Louis was at the residence that afternoon because his parents were at a reception in central London, and because an 8-year-old on a half-term Tuesday has to be somewhere. He was looking for his great-aunt. Those 2 get on, which surprises people who only know Anne from photographs, and which stops surprising anybody who has watched her with small children for more than about 4 minutes. She talks to them like adults and she has horses. He came along the upper corridor past the private sitting rooms and he did not stop, hide, listen at a door, or do anything else the sillier versions of this story have him doing. He walked past a door that was not properly shut, and he heard his step-grandmother laughing. That is all. That is the whole of what an 8-year-old contributed to this, and anybody telling it any other way is inventing. He got to Anne's study, sat down on the arm of a chair the way children do, and said something completely ordinary in the middle of something else. He said that Granny Camilla sounded better because she was laughing on the telephone and walking about. Now watch what Anne did with that, because this is the part that matters, and it is the opposite of what the internet says she did. She did not treat it as evidence. There is no evidence in it. A woman who has been signed off for exhaustion can laugh on a telephone, and a woman recovering from a bad fortnight can walk about her own room. And if that had been the whole story, then Anne would have made a note of nothing and got on with the ledgers. The boy's remark did something much smaller than that and much more useful. It told her that the person in that room was well enough to hold a conversation. And a patient well enough to hold a conversation is a patient well enough to have been asked whether she wanted a paragraph about her job put into her own medical letter. One more thing about that afternoon, and it is the reason none of this ever rested on a child. The protection officer was in the room. He is always in the room, that is the job, and he heard the boy say it as well. That matters for a practical reason rather than a sentimental one. At no point after that Tuesday did anybody have to ask an 8-year-old to repeat anything, confirm anything, or stand in front of anybody and say what he had heard. He said one sentence to his great-aunt about somebody sounding better in front of an adult witness, and then he was taken to the kitchen and given something to eat, and he had no further part in any of it. Nobody in that study ever mentioned his name. That question has an answer. Answers can be checked. And checking it did not require accusing anybody of anything, which is exactly the position Anne had been waiting 3 days to be in. Let me put the second and last bit of technical language in here, because everything after it depends on it, and it takes 15 seconds. A clinical letter is a record. It says what the clinician found, what the clinician concluded, and what the clinician recommends for treatment. That is its whole job. A doctor can absolutely write that a patient needs rest, that a patient should not work for 6 weeks, that a patient should reduce their commitments. All of that is medicine. The one thing a doctor does not do, because it is not medicine and because it is not his to say, is specify which particular administrative responsibility the patient should keep hold of, and which specific proposed reorganization of somebody else's institution should not go ahead. The first is a doctor talking about a patient. The second is a doctor talking about a decision. That paragraph was the second one wearing the first one's clothes. Anne did not send an aide. She did not ring the clinic. She did not ask a private secretary to make an appointment, and she did not go anywhere near her brother. She went down to her car, told her protection officer where they were going, and was outside the building in Chelsea inside half an hour. Understand what that looks like from inside a private clinic on an ordinary Tuesday. A woman walks in unannounced with one officer behind her. The receptionist is 24 and has never met anybody remotely like this. Anne asked, politely and without raising her voice, for the consultant by name, and then she waited standing up in a waiting room with 2 other patients in it for 11 minutes, because he was with somebody and she was not going to interrupt a consultation. 11 minutes in a waiting room with a copy of a country magazine on the table. She has done this before, at other institutions, over other things. People who have worked with her describe it as the single most effective thing in her repertoire. She does not shout, she does not announce herself, and she does not leave. The 11 minutes are worth sitting with, because of what she did with them and because of who saw it. 2 other patients were in that waiting room. One of them, a woman in her 60s waiting for a follow-up, said afterwards that she had spent 4 of those 11 minutes trying to work out whether she was imagining it, and the other 7 wondering whether to say anything, and had decided not to. Anne read a country magazine. She did not use her telephone once. The receptionist offered to see whether the consultant could be interrupted, and she said there was no need, and sat back down. That is not modesty. It is method. A person who insists on being seen immediately gives the other side 5 minutes to prepare, and 5 minutes is all most people need. The consultant came out at about 3:20 and took her into his office. He is not a fraudster, and he did not take a bribe, and there is no Swiss bank account in this story, whatever you may have read. He is a man in his 50s with a long career, a busy private list and a reputation he has spent 30 years building. He had done something much more ordinary than a crime, and much easier to do, and it is the reason this happens more often than anybody admits. Anne asked him one question. She asked him whether he had written the second paragraph on page 2. He said no. Not immediately, and not comfortably. 2 people who were in the corridor outside that office say there was a long pause first. But he said no, and then he got up and went to a filing cabinet, and he came back with a printed email chain that he had kept, which tells you he had been uneasy about this for a fortnight. The paragraph had arrived at the clinic already written. It came in at 11 minutes past 9 on the Thursday morning, from an address inside the Queen's private office to the practice manager, copied to nobody. The body of it was 4 lines long and entirely polite. It said that the household had prepared suggested wording for the closing section of the letter and would be grateful to see it reflected, and that the household understood the clinical content remained entirely a matter for the consultant. Under it, in a separate block, sat 31 words. The same 31 words that came off the printer 3 days later on clinic paper, over a doctor's signature, in slightly the wrong typeface. He had queried it. That is on the chain as well, and it is the part that finished the argument before it started, because he had put his objection in writing himself. He wrote back that afternoon saying that the suggested wording went beyond what he could properly certify, that the specific arrangement of the patient's duties was outside his competence to comment on, and that he would prefer to describe the need for rest in general terms. The reply came back inside 40 minutes. It thanked him. It said the wording had already been discussed and agreed at the appropriate level, and that the household would be grateful if the letter could go out in the agreed form by Friday. Discussed and agreed at the appropriate level. 9 words doing an enormous amount of work, containing no name, no date, and no meeting, and impossible to check by a man in Chelsea with a full list and a letter to get out. He put the paragraph in. Anne asked him why, and his answer is the most honest thing anybody says in this entire story. He said that he assumed somebody senior had cleared it, that pushing back a second time would have meant a fight with a royal household over a form of words, and that he had a waiting room full of people. That is it. That is the whole of the machinery. No bribe, no conspiracy, no money moving anywhere. One tired professional, one polite email he could not verify, and one paragraph he did not believe in, put into a document because arguing about it was going to cost him an afternoon he did not have. Institutions are not usually brought down by villains. They are brought down by 9 words in an email that nobody can trace to a person. Anne asked him whether he would come and say that to the king. He asked whether he had a choice. She said that he did, and that if he preferred she would take the printed chain herself and he would hear about it later, and that in her experience it was better to be the person in the room than the person being described in it. He got his coat. She had him back at the palace by 4:30, and she took him in through the side entrance and not the front, because a man in a suit carrying a folder through the front of that building at that hour becomes a story by 6. And this is where the 11 words at the start of this video happen. Anne came up the corridor in the East Wing, where a private secretary was already waiting outside the study with the interim instrument in a folder, ready for a signature that afternoon. Cancel the medical transfer and have the private secretary wait outside. She did not knock. She opened her brother's door, went in, and closed it behind her with a consultant physician standing in the room. I have thought about what that must have been like from inside for a good while, because Charles had spent 4 days believing something specific about the week he was having, and he was about to stop believing it in front of a stranger. He looked up and asked her, apparently quite gently, whether it could wait. She said that it could not, that the paragraph in the letter had not been written by any doctor, that the man standing next to her had been sent it in an email from his wife's office 3 days before it appeared over his signature, and that he had the printout. Then she stood back and let the consultant speak, which is the single most Anne thing in this whole file. She did not present it herself. She had the person who could be questioned do the talking, in front of the person entitled to question him. It took about 40 minutes. The consultant walked the king through the chain. The original email at 11 minutes past 9. His own objection. The reply. The final letter. He was careful, several times, to say the thing that mattered most, and that has been lost in every retelling since. The illness was real. He had assessed her himself. She was exhausted and she was low, and both of those findings were his, and he stood by every clinical word in that document. The only part of it he had not written was the part about her job. Charles did not say anything for a long time. Somebody who was in the room said the king put both hands flat on the desk and looked at them, and that the thing on his face was not anger. 30 years earlier, a version of this had happened in the same building to a different woman, and the whole country had eventually found out about it, and the man sitting at that desk had spent the rest of his life being asked why nobody stopped it. A description of a woman, written by somebody who was not in the room with her, used to decide what she was allowed to hold. The difference this time was the direction it was pointing. Before that, one detail from the study that nobody has been able to explain, and I have tried. Charles asked the consultant one question of his own before he sent for his wife, and it was not about the email. He asked him whether, in his clinical judgment, taking the household accounts away from her would have harmed her at all. The consultant said no. He said the opposite, in fact. He said that in his experience, a patient in that condition benefits from having less to hold rather than more, and that if anybody had asked him what he would recommend, he would have recommended she be relieved of exactly the responsibility the paragraph was written to preserve. The king sat with that for a moment and then said, "Thank you. 2 decades of watching a family manage a woman through paperwork, and the one time somebody in that building thought to ask a doctor for his own opinion, the answer turned out to be the reverse of the document." He sent for her at about 5:10. She came down still in character, and that detail has been given by 4 people, and it is the hardest one in the file. Slowly, a hand on the wall at the turn of the stairs, dressing gown over a nightdress, one of her women half a step behind her in case she needed an arm. She got 3 or 4 words out about the doctors saying she should not be up. Then she saw the consultant standing beside Anne. Everybody who describes that moment describes the same sequence, and it takes about 1.5 seconds. She stops walking. The hand comes off the wall. And her face does the thing that woman has spent 20 years making certain no camera ever gets, which is nothing at all for slightly too long. Charles told her that the consultant had been through the correspondence with him. She said the pressure had been unbearable, that she had wanted to protect the household through a difficult period, and that Anne had been working on him for months. He asked her one question, and it is the only thing he said in the whole exchange that anybody has repeated word for word. He asked her whether she had known the paragraph was going to be sent. She did not answer it. That is the entire climax of this story. Not a confession, not a scene, not a shouted accusation. A question about an email, and a silence in a study, in front of a man from a clinic in Chelsea who was standing there wishing he were anywhere else on earth. Anne stepped forward with the instrument that had been in the diary for the previous Friday, and that Charles had signed about 10 minutes before his wife came downstairs. Every discretionary budget assigned to the Queen's office revoked. Every private allowance under that office suspended pending review. Control of the private purse with Anne permanently, with no interim arrangement and no review date. The private communications operation dissolved. The staff on it offered redeployment inside the main household, and she would not be sleeping in that building. She left for Ray Mill that evening. Ray Mill House is hers. That is worth saying properly because a great many people watching will assume she was put out on the street, and she was not. She bought that house in Wiltshire in 1995, before any of it, and she kept it after the marriage and has always kept it, and she has gone there most weekends for 20 years. It is the one address in her life that has never had anything to do with him. She went there at 7 in the evening, in the rain, in a dark coat, out through the side entrance rather than the front. The humiliation is not the car, and it is not the rain. It is the corridor. The private secretary was still standing outside that study at 7:10 with the folder under his arm. He had been there since 4. Nobody had told him he could go because nobody had thought about him at all, and he was still holding the interim instrument that would have given her the household when she walked past him on her way out. Neither of them said anything. 4 members of staff on that corridor saw it. The consultant went back to work on the Wednesday morning and saw a full list. Nothing happened to him. No regulator has opened anything, because on the evidence he did not falsify a clinical finding, and he did not certify anything he believed to be untrue about a patient. He included a paragraph outside his competence, having said in writing that it was outside his competence, having been told it had been agreed above him. His practice manager left the following month. That is the only career in this story that ended, and she had done nothing except forward an email from a royal household to the consultant it was addressed to, which is her entire job. The people who write the paragraph are never the people who pay for it. That is close to a rule. Nothing was announced, nothing needed to be. The Wiltshire house has 8 bedrooms and a garden she does herself, and she got there at about 8:30. Nobody has ever suggested she was unwelcome in it. It is hers, it always has been, and she has spent more nights there over 20 years than in any royal residence. The point of that evening was never where she went. It was that for the first time since 2005, she went there without anything from the other place travelling with her. The following morning she was not at an engagement she had been listed for, and the listing had not been withdrawn, which is the single loudest thing that building ever does by accident. 2 correspondents noticed inside a day. The absence of any bulletin about a queen who had been unwell enough to disappear for 4 days was noticed by more of them the day after that. By the weekend, the outline was in 3 papers, and the outline was close enough to correct to have come from somebody who had been on that floor. The palace said nothing at all, which is standard and which works about half as well as it used to. Somebody left a comment under one of my videos a while back, and it has stuck with me since. They wrote that in that family the paper always outlives the person who wrote it, and that everybody there knows it, and everybody there behaves as though they have forgotten. An email at 9:11 on a Thursday morning. 4 lines, extremely polite, sent to a practice manager, copied to nobody. Now let me pay back what I held at the start. The thing that ended this was never the illness, and the title of this video is doing that word a disservice, so let me be exact about it. The exhaustion was real. The consultant assessed her, he found it, he stood by it in front of the king, and he has not withdrawn a word of it since. The fake part was not her health. The fake part was her incapacity. She was tired and she was low, and she was also perfectly capable of running her own office. And somewhere in that fortnight somebody decided that the gap between those 2 facts was a space you could put a paragraph in. 31 words, describing a woman as more fragile than she was, sent to a doctor pre-written, so that a man who loves her would not be able to sign a document on a Friday afternoon. Tell me below whether you think the consultant should have refused it the second time, because I go back and forth on that and I am not settled. And stay for the next one, because the review of those discretionary allowances is still running, and the first tranche of it covers a period of 4 years. The review is still running and the first tranche of it covers 4 years. The findings so far are not dramatic, and that is exactly why they are damaging. No missing money, no invented invoices, a long, dull list of arrangements that were set up on a verbal instruction, renewed annually by nobody in particular, and paid without anybody ever asking again what the person was for. One of them had been running since 2019. And the last thing, because it is the thing this whole story is really about. For 15 years, a woman in that same building was described in documents she was never shown, by people who were not in the room with her, in language that sounded clinical and was not. Difficult, not coping, needs managing. Every one of those descriptions was used to decide something about her, and not one of them was ever signed by anybody who could be asked about it afterwards. Diana never got to see a single one of those pages. Somebody in that palace put 31 words about a woman into a doctor's letter 30 years later, and this time a member of that family picked the page up, looked at the typeface, and went and found out who wrote it. She spent 20 years building the only thing in that palace that was hers rather than his. Staff she chose, budgets she controlled, an operation nobody outside her office could see into. And she lost every single piece of it in one afternoon because somebody in that office wanted the wording tidied and could not be bothered to write it themselves, and sent a man in Chelsea 31 words about a job that was never any of his business. If you'd like more of this, I write a free letter every week. Join more than 10,000 royal insiders at crownletter.com. The link's in the pinned comment. If you're watching on your TV, just point your phone at the QR code on screen and I'll see you there.